Welcome back. I'm joined by Andrea Mrozek, a senior fellow at Cardus, as we unpack a recent demographic report about the declining birth rate and fertility rate, rather, in Canada. Now, Andrea, again, the author of this report is Lyman Stone, who's a demographer. And one thing he stated in an interview is that every other Canadian woman in her 40s is missing a child she wanted. And that statement really shocked me when you step back and think about it for a moment. And I think that's really the crux of what our conversation is, I mean, we could talk about fertility choice and people wanting to have 4 kids or 2 kids or things, but if women are saying that we want to have children, but we are not, feeling forced to choose not to, then I think we need to ask why. So why are women feeling like they're missing a child?
Um, well, I'll talk about that. I also want to acknowledge just how painful this is for the women who are missing children, and so I often just want to acknowledge that because I'll post about the articles I've written on fertility on Facebook or what have you, and I'll get some pretty gut wrenching replies from both men and women, to be fair, about the families they wish to have had and couldn't. So the target audience for a report like this is truly our policymakers and our leaders and the people who ought to be addressing this, who ought to know about it, who ought
Right.
to know better at this point and don't. Um, as for that demographic of women who end their reproductive lives with the desire to have a children but no children, and why that is, we have some very concrete answers in our survey. One of them is the top five were wanting to grow as a person, the desire to save money, wanting to focus on career, the idea that kids require intense care. And then the fifth one is the inability to find a partner. And so mixed
Mm.
and mingled in there are some things we think are, fall into categories of things that are easier to talk about, easier to address, and the things that really, truly would be quasi impossible for a government to get at. They fall more into the cultural milieu. But that said, government's part of culture, so they can also take steps towards changing the culture, even as there's a partnership there. So we can talk a bit more about that if you wish.
Yeah, so let's start with the glaring one that a lot of people say, well, children are expensive. It's too expensive to have children. I'll have to move. I'll have to buy a house. Housing's expensive. I can't afford it. I'm already getting taxed at such a high rate. How am I going to afford to have a child? So, what are some of the economic obstacles to families having children in Canada?
Yeah, and to be fair, that list is the list of obstacles to having children and the reasons women gave for not choosing to have children in the next 2 years. It was a very long list. So the desire to save money is kind of a broad top level category. There are other answers on the survey that fell well out of the top 10, pointing, I think, to the fact that economics is not the only barrier. It's one barrier, but economics is not the only barrier. We, of
Mm.
course, asked specifically about housing costs and Housing and childcare are often raised as huge cost factors, and those fell quite low on the list. So
Really?
I
Okay, that's an
personally view,
interesting point. That's a very interesting point.
yeah, and the lack of paid leave also something that fell low on the list. I view the desire to save money as really coming together with that idea of focusing on career, which partners with the idea that we have a life script today that is contrary to women's fertility timelines.
Mm.
I followed this life script. You go to school, you get expensive schooling, you um, finish your master's degree, then you want to establish yourself in your career. You have to pay off the schooling. And then by the time you are done all that, you kind of are on a life course that is not as conducive to family life. So the top item there of wanting to grow as a person is, to me, also figuring in with the wanting to save money and the needing to focus on career, which is all part of a life script that we have culturally established here in North America today and across the Western world, which is pretty incongruous and not compatible with having children during the time frame that Mother Nature typically allows.
Yeah, it was a fair point. I have friends who are professionals. I know some of them said, "Well, I'll have children once I'm a partner." I mean, those are intense hours. I can totally see why they don't want to have a child in that period of time, but that could take years. Well, it does take years, and it seems very unfair to women that there is this choice being forced upon them rather than them truly choosing. And yeah, so I do. That's a very interesting point. So, because I thought, okay, housing and this and that, that those would be some of the top issues, but clearly your raw data says no. So that's very
Yep.
interesting. Daycare wasn't a huge factor. That's, again, we always hear this rhetoric in the news headlines, parents struggling to find daycare. I always thought that might turn people off from having a child. We have about 10
Well,
seconds.
yeah, no, apparently not. And that's important to understand. The childcare phenomenon is top of mind, but it's not actually inhibiting people from choosing to have children.
Okay, great. We're going to continue this discussion in just a few moments.